And does anyone remember where we left off? We actually managed to finish the chapter on anger finally after many, many sessions on that. And now it's this book for those who are coming for the first time. Don't worry if you don't have it, because I'll be reading it out. And the main point of this these sessions is to have a discussion. And we are now on page 71, which is the introduction to the chapter on proper speech. Chapter, I guess, 4. And I thought I'd just read out a little part of the introduction to get us going. I've seen that someone else has sent a message, so just to tell you that I have read your message. I don't want to read it out now, we're recording. Very nice, thanks Melanie. So I'm going to just read a little bit of the introduction out to you, which relates to today's topic. And we'll see how far we get, but I think we won't get much further than a couple of pages because, again, it has to relate to our lives. So the introductions to these chapters are written by the Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, and they're really beautifully written, and I think really help to bring the meaning out of these texts. So are you all ready? Yay! Okay, one of the distinctive traits of human beings which differentiates them from animals is their capacity for speech. Words can create enmity or friendship, can win or harden hearts, can deceive others or open them to new pathways of understanding. Social transformations in the course of history have been facilitated by speech, whether spoken or written. Just think of the impact of the Declaration of Independence, the Communist Manifesto, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. By means of speech, new ideas are disseminated, new insights shared, and new horizons opened to human investigation. Speech has ignited wars and fostered peace. All the hopes and yearnings of the human heart in every sphere of our collective existence have found expression through the medium of speech. In regard to the Dhamma, the role of speech is so important that the Buddha says one of the 2 conditions for the arising of right view, and that is the arising of right view as a stream enterer, is the utterance of another, the word of another. Recognizing the pivotal role of speech in both the Noble Eightfold Path and among the 10 courses of wholesome action, the Buddha assigned 4 places to speech. So these you'll be familiar with. Abstaining from false speech, from divisive speech, from harsh speech, and from idle chatter or gossip. So these are the ones that I usually use, the acronym for my higher good, FMHG. So false, malicious, harsh, and gossip. So these are the not tos, but we'll go into much more detail than that. So then in the next part, which we may get onto today, Bhikkhu Bodhi expands on this earlier discussion by taking proper speech as a separate topic in its own right. The chapter begins with 2 short suttas on the constituents of well-spoken speech, one enumerating 4 factors and the other 5. Since the 2 do not completely correspond, the factors of well-spoken speech can be increased beyond the usual group of 4. The groupings by the Buddha are just for the sake of memory and some sort of way, remembering, right, that this is a spoken teaching, some way that we can really grasp an idea, but it's never kind of exclusive or completely comprehensive. So of course we can add other factors, and I think that's something we can all do together as well. We can expand this to fit our own experiences. So the Buddha also provides advice for those intent on holding discussions and participating in debates, which were commonplace among the contemporary ascetic and contemplative communities that flourished in northern India. These usually centered around a charismatic teacher. Adherents of rival sects would often meet to discuss and debate their respective tenets. Entire parks were set aside for wandering ascetics to dwell and discuss their views, and the larger towns featured a debating hall where ascetics would gather for debates. Even now, it feels like that in India. People love to discuss anything philosophical and really have it out, you know, they don't hold back. So it's really the kind of place you can imagine a Buddha appearing, because there's so much of a genuine quest for truth. And it's something that I haven't found so much in other Southeast Asian countries, places like Thailand and Myanmar. I think the education systems and the societies are quite different, not so democratic. And yet those countries have been very effective in preserving the teachings of the Buddha, especially in Myanmar. Like, they're really very good at taking something from the Buddha with a heart of absolute faith and keeping it preserved without distortion for generations. So to me, it's really interesting to see these cultural differences, you know, where new ideas are formed and then where they can be preserved and kept in a kind of sanctity, so that they're there for us today. So even now in India, it's a very vibrant place. So while the Buddha tried to avoid fruitless debates conducted for the purpose of humiliating others and bolstering pride in one's own tenets, it was inevitable that as monks and nuns, I should say nuns and monks, wandered among the towns of northern India, they would be drawn into discussions with Brahmins, philosophers, and ascetics of opposing views. In order to preserve the good repute of the Dhamma, they had to know how to engage in debate. One of the qualifications of the well-trained disciple was the ability to explain their own teacher's doctrine, to teach it, proclaim it, establish it, disclose it, analyze and elucidate it, and to refute thoroughly with reasons the prevalent tenets of others and teach the efficacious Dhamma. Is that right? Efficacious? Yeah. In the next text, or maybe it's the same text, the Buddha lays down standards for his own disciples to adopt when engaging in debates. He distinguishes among the different types of questions that might be asked, indicates how one should respond to these questions, and prescribes the attitudes one should bring to a debate. These are summed up in the concluding verses of this passage. The sagely person, that means basically the stream winner, so the saintly person, I would prefer to say, speaks without quarrelsomeness or pride, utters speech that the noble ones practice, and speaks in ways connected with the Dhamma and the meaning. That's the Dhamma and Artha, A-R-T-H-A, which is kind of like the Dhamma and where that Dhamma leads, basically, the consequence of understanding the Dhamma. It should lead to liberation. So that's just the little part of the introduction that relates to what we may get through today. And I want to just begin and read out the first couple of short paragraphs and see if we have something to discuss around that. And then we might get into the longer one around holding discussions or debates, which I'm sure we can relate to, because that's where we have our arguments, right? And things can either turn for the benefit of everyone and to deepen our understanding, or they can actually turn the opposite way and cause a lot of strife and a lot of quarrel, especially when it becomes personal and turns into an attack. So how are we doing already? Are there anything to clarify yet, or shall we start? Yeah, all good? So, page 75 now, well-spoken speech. Possessing 4 factors. And as usual, I'll make the language a little bit more inclusive. So when it says monks, I'll say community. It does refer to the monastic Sangha, usually, but that's only because the Buddha was teaching them at that point. These things are universal and applicable to all. So the Blessed One said this: community, when speech possesses 4 factors, it is well spoken, not badly spoken, and it is blameless and irreproachable among the wise. That's often a standard that he uses, this being irreproachable among the wise. So we're actually referring to our teachers and people we respect to give us some guidance here. And it's quite interesting to me that that comes in the first sentence, because these days, sometimes we don't know who's wise, right? We don't really have people to look up to in the way that we might wish we did. So what for? Here, someone speaks only what is well spoken, not what is badly spoken. They speak only the Dhamma, not non-Dhamma. They speak only what is pleasant, not what is unpleasant. And they speak only what is true, not lies. So the last one is obviously the most basic aspect of right speech, not lying, which is a very coarse thing to do because you're basically out of line with the truth, right? How can you lie and really be in contact with the reality or what's true for us? Especially when the whole path is a quest and a deepening, a subtle deepening towards truth, and the subtlest of all truths. If we're not even able to accurately reflect truth in our speech, then we're far away from ultimate truth in a sense. So well spoken, not badly spoken, only Dhamma, not non-Dhamma, pleasant and not what is unpleasant. So I find this quite interesting, and this evening I'm with a friend here, a good Dhamma sister, and we had a discussion around what does it mean to speak only Dhamma and not non-Dhamma. And so I thought maybe we could put that to you and see what you think about that, because obviously everybody thinks they know what the Dhamma is, right? So exactly what does that mean to you? I would really like to open for any questions or comments here, if you have any. And if you don't want your voice to be on the recording, you're very welcome to write anything in the box at any point, and I can answer it there. So I'm going to ask Rob to unmute. Hi.
Yeah, the Dharma to me means the teachings of the Buddha, basically, slash the truth in relation to suffering. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So how would that manifest as speech, do you think? Like the truth in relation to suffering, would that be like representing how you really feel at the time, or being true to your situation?
Yeah. So speech, well, if you say something horrible to someone, they suffer, don't they? Right. So, but it can also happen the other way as well. So I guess in relation to speech, for me, it's about how speech, internal speech and external speech, can affect how you feel.
Yeah, wonderful. So whether it's leading to wholesome states increasing or not.
Yeah.
The opposite way. And I like the way you made that link between external and internal speech, which I think is often missed, because sometimes we're quite good at speaking kindly to others, but not so much to ourselves. And we think it doesn't matter because no one can see it, you know, we can just kind of hide it away, or we think we deserve to be spoken to that way by ourselves. But, you know, if we think like, okay, how would it feel if someone else spoke to us like that? We can perhaps have a better gauge of whether it's good speech or not. Yeah, super. So yeah, I do think that the Dhamma generally means the Buddha's teachings in this context, probably more so. And one of the things we were talking together about is like, how far do we take that? You know, like, do we just speak only about the Buddha's teachings, or do we still have to say, okay, who's going to wash the dishes tonight? You know, so, but what would happen if we did speak only about the Dhamma, or at least frame our experience in terms of the Eightfold Path, you know, really trying hard to use our speech kindly, even if it didn't always feel, even if it goes really against our habits to do that, you know, and we maybe lose friends over it. You know, maybe some of your friends aren't so interested in you anymore because you're not as entertaining or lively or sensationalistic. So what would it actually be to speak only the Dhamma? It's a question that I find quite interesting. Yeah. And I think it does start with speaking in ways that are wholesome and that lead to happiness, but maybe it can even, you know, in a monastery, ideally, we don't talk about anything that's not related to our practice. I mean, it doesn't mean we can't talk about interpersonal difficulties or, you know, kind of practical things about our way of life, but it's all very clearly aimed at one thing, which is deepening our meditation, deepening, you know, the path. So I think it's quite inspiring to, you know, try to use speech in that way, you know, to have the intention to use our speech in a way that deepens our practice, rather than just use it in kind of careless or ways that, yeah, careless ways are also ways that kind of consolidate our sense of being right, you know, our sense of self and like, I know best, I got it right. So, yes, I shall continue. If there are no more questions or comments on that, we can go to the next little bit. So here the Buddha's speaking about 5 factors. So community, when speech possesses 5 factors, it is well spoken, not badly spoken, and it's blameless and irreproachable among the wise. What 5? It is spoken at the proper time. What is said is true. It is spoken gently. What is said is beneficial, and it's spoken with a mind of loving kindness. When speech possesses these 5 factors, it's well spoken, not badly spoken, blameless and irreproachable among the wise. So I think we've talked about that quite a lot in the past, haven't we? About the right time to address things, the right time to address people, you know, not to kind of tell them something that they may not like to hear when they're already quite fragile, or when they're tired, or they've just come in through the door. You know, maybe to ask their permission before we approach them about something, especially if it's tricky. Or even sometimes, have you ever had it where people lavish loads and loads of praise on you and it starts to feel really excessive and uncomfortable? That can also sometimes be not quite the proper time or the proper measure of speech. So what is said is true, gentle, it's spoken gently, it's beneficial, and spoken with a mind of loving kindness. So this is very beautiful, I think, you know, especially looking at both the motivation and the way you speak and when you speak, and the kind of purpose of that speech as well, you know, that it should be for somebody's benefit, not only our own, but theirs as well. So as far as possible. So are there any questions or comments around this before we go into the slightly more in-depth analysis? Melanie, I'll ask you to unmute. Hi.
Hello. It's probably because I had a long day, but I have trouble understanding the first sutta, in fact, maybe because I'm less familiar with it. When it's written, he speaks only what is pleasant, not unpleasant. What is it talking about? What is it, the subject? I mean,
Right.
is like not talk about things that are not pleasant, but to whom? Like talking about war, or I don't know, tortures, or it's not very clear for me. So if you could.
Yeah, thank you for that. I kind of went quickly over that because it's not that clear to me either. Because on the one hand, it has to be true, and on the other, pleasant but not unpleasant. And yet in the next one, it says that it should be beneficial, right? So couldn't it be unpleasant, and yet it could be beneficial and true? And in another sutta, the Buddha actually says that is the case. Like sometimes the speech is unpleasant, but if it's true and beneficial, and if it follows all these other factors, that it's spoken gently at the right time, etc., then it's still okay to utter it in certain circumstances. So I think this is when it gets a little bit nuanced, and we need to ask ourselves that question, like, what does it mean, pleasant and unpleasant? Because we can't, you know, predict another person's response. We can't know whether they find it pleasant or not. So I don't think it's so much in the quality, like how it makes them feel, but maybe it's more in whether it's friendly or really quite unfriendly, you know, like really quite nasty speech, unpleasant speech. I would think of it more in relation to this speech itself. But yeah, no, here it actually does say speaks only what is pleasant, not what is unpleasant. So yeah, I mean, I think we always have to look at where we're coming from. But here it also seems to talk about the content a little bit as well. So I think it's a rolling question. Has anybody else got any idea on that? It's not Nikki, yeah? Hi.
Hi, yeah, I was going to ask about that too, actually, because I was thinking about, say, in relationship, when you have to talk to somebody and they don't want to hear what you need to say. So you might be, and it's going to be unpleasant for them to hear it, yet it's truth. And, you know, you could be, you know, saying it's all in line with everything, but they're going to find it really unpleasant quite often. You can't avoid that, can you?
Not really, no, because life is going to have suffering involved, right? And maybe that's why we get these other checklists to kind of understand the Dhamma in a context that we can at least try and minimize. I would say it's about kind of trying to minimize any possible harm or any possible pain or conflict involved, right? Because the whole point is that we're speaking basically to try and bring about benefit for ourselves and for the other person. So yeah, sometimes we have to take maybe a short-term unpleasant situation and just kind of go with that for the sake of a long-term benefit. But I do think it points towards being really, really careful, because sometimes we think that we're going to be, you know, benefiting ourselves or the relationship longer term, but often we just want to kind of get something off our chest and make ourselves feel better. And perhaps it's pointing more towards care, being really careful. And possibly in the context of what we discussed, you know, about these debatings in India at the time of the Buddha, maybe there was a lot of unpleasant speech, like overt kind of criticism and blame and, you know, nastiness, kind of trying to defeat the rival. So I think it's probably pointing more towards that kind of unpleasantness than something that's, you know, just a little bit uncomfortable to the person initially.
It's about perspective as well, isn't it? I guess each individual will have a different perspective on what's the words, like words.
Yeah.
I get unpleasant when I want to speak the truth. You know, that's so it's a bit like, oh, I'm only speaking my truth, and then it's and there's an accusation of being, especially as a woman as well, my goodness, trying to, you know, it's all sorts of things come in then. And so, I don't know, it makes me feel a bit, I know what you're saying, and I know what it, yeah, so I kind of, yeah.
Right. In other words, are you sort of saying that we're already, especially as women, so kind of, we find it so hard in a way to express ourselves and to feel that we have permission to be honest and true to ourselves, that when you read this, it can sometimes sound a little bit inhibiting?
Well, yeah, like, cause it's always this thing about being nurturing all the time. And sometimes I don't want to be nurturing. I just want to speak my truth and, you know, nicely, you know, like that. But then there's that perspective, like other person's perspective on that might be loaded with their stuff. So it's a minefield. I know it's a minefield out there.
I don't think it's talking so much about their perspective on what you say. I think it's talking about the content of the speech itself. So I actually think it might be much simpler than that in this particular context.
Yeah, probably.
You know, that the speech is just generally not meant to be unpleasant.
Yeah.
But we can never account for other people's reactions, and that's not our business. You know, Ajahn Chah said we should look at ourselves like 95% of the time and others maximum 5%. So we can't actually, like, you know, please everybody all the time. And it's not our job to make other people feel always comfortable, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it's more about, you know, just looking at the content of our speech and the motivation behind it and trying to speak, you know, what's beneficial. And also who we speak it to, right? Rob, do you have something else to say on that?
Yeah, just wanted to point out where it says the link between right speech and right intention, where it says spoken with a mind of loving kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think right intention sets up right speech.
Absolutely.
You don't need to think about the words sometimes if you've got the right attitude there, the right intention, it kind of happens automatically. Yeah.
Yes, it does to a degree. I mean, I totally agree with that, in that, you know, the second factor of the Noble Path is one of the factors of wisdom, right view and right motivation or right intention set up the rest of the path, basically, because if you're coming with that understanding of suffering and, you know, the wish to alleviate suffering for yourself and others, and then, you know, you are trying to align your intentions with kindness and gentleness and, you know, non-harm, and also letting go of that sense of self, right? This nekama, this renunciation, letting go of being right, then it's much, much more likely that your speech is going to be beneficial and productive and gentle as well. And yet there's also a dialogue, and I don't know much about this in the context of, say, working in anti-racism or anti-sexism. I don't know if that's actually known as a thing yet very much, of noticing that there is intention, but there's also consequence. There's also, what do they say, impact. There's intention, but there's impact as well. And maybe this idea of speaking what is pleasant, not unpleasant, is also looking not only at where you're coming from, but the potential impact it might have on others. You know, so being even more sensitive, say, to, I don't know, speaking about discrimination to people who are maybe already burned out from suffering that discrimination, just as a quick example. So I think, you know, it's both. And I do think that if we have our intention right, we're not actually creating negative karma, but we still need to care about how our speech lands, you know. Because you can have a good intention, but the other person might be kind of exhausted and just really trying to keep up with you. And you're all full of metta, but they're really exhausted, for example, right? So yeah, I guess there's many, many aspects to it. But I also want to say right now, because we're already going into a lot of detail, that this is not for us to get so tense that we daren't speak, right? Because we've got to be true and open. So anything more on this little part before we go into the even more complex part? We've still got time, lots of time. Yeah, carry on. All right. So the next part is about holding discussions. And again, I was a little bit boggled by all of this because I just got back after 3 weeks of traveling around with Ajahn Brahm, and before that 5 days of jet lag settling in, and my brain was a bit fried. So I spoke with my friend about this and we came up with a few ideas about what it might mean. So I'll see if I can put a few examples in and then ask you also for some examples or ideas what it means. I think we also have a bit of an expert here in nonviolent communication, isn't that right? Somebody here, I think, is quite keen on that, so do feel free to draw on that as well. So it is in relation to talk, let's call them monastics this time, that a person may be understood as either fit to talk or unfit to talk. If this person is asked a question that should be answered categorically, and they do not answer it categorically, if they're asked a question that should be answered after making a distinction, and they answer it without making a distinction, if they're asked a question that should be answered with a counter question, and they answer it without asking a counter question, and if they are asked a question that should be set aside, and they do not set it aside, in such a case, this person is unfit to talk. So this is quite a lot more detailed now, right? And I think from looking at it recently today, unfortunately I lost my big Sutta books. I'm not quite sure where they are at the moment. It seems very much related to this debating, and the first part of answering categorically and not answering it categorically is fairly clear, right? It's maybe something that deserves a clear answer and you just kind of don't do that. So it's actually quite obvious almost straight away that this person is not really ready to have a discussion. It also could relate to something that's quite obvious, such as what is sexual misconduct, right? Is sexual misconduct just kind of not cheating on your partner, or, you know, is cheating on your partner fine? We can answer that fairly categorically, right? We can pretty much say it's good not to cheat on your partner. Like it's breaking sila to cheat. So that's something that's categorical. And then the next bit that should be answered after making a distinction and answer it without making a distinction might be that there's some kind of different circumstances that we need to be aware of. There might be like different levels of karma produced by that act, for example. So there we could make a distinction in different cases. And then ask a question that should be answered with a counter question, which is something quite common, I think, in the debating methods that are used in India and also in Tibet, that we kind of, you know, somebody asks a question and instead of answering, you ask a counter question. And in my life, I can say that that's sometimes I sometimes use that method if I'm not really sure that I've understood what the person's trying to say. You know, I might ask, well, did you mean it this way or that way? Or what kind of answer would you like? Would you like me to listen, or would you like me to actually give advice, for example? You know, we can actually ask a little bit more before we reply. Or if somebody's maybe deferring something to you that shouldn't be deferred to you, you can defer it back to the other, right? So you don't have to always answer straight out with a question, with an answer. And then asked a question that should be set aside but does not set it aside. In this case, this person is unfit to talk. And there's actually a little footnote here, which I'm going to just have a look at in the back. It might say more about this. Footnote 3. Oh, yeah, here we go. Okay, here's some really good examples in the notes. So the first one, a question that should be answered categorically is, for example, is the eye impermanent? Which should be answered categorically with a yes, it is impermanent. Right? So that's a straight yes or no answer. Unless, of course, you think it's permanent. Then you're not fit to talk. Number 2, a question that should be answered after making a distinction is, for example, is the impermanent the eye? Which should be answered by making a distinction. Not only the eye, but the ear, the nose, etc. are also impermanent. So here we're getting a little bit subtler and we're trying to open up the discussion to extend it a little bit. A question that should be answered with a counter question is, for example, does the eye have the same nature as the ear? And one should answer this by asking, with respect to what? If they reply with respect to seeing, one should answer no. If they reply with respect to impermanence, one should answer yes. So we're trying to get a lot more clarity about what's really being asked here. But you can see this is very kind of technical, like Dhamma discussion, right, and debate. And these are methods that would have been very common then. And then the question that should be set aside is, for example, is the soul the same as the body? So it's all those questions that the Buddha always shirked about. You know, he didn't want to answer these questions on soul and things being eternal and all those other things. So this should be set aside without answering it, saying, this has not been declared by the Tathagata, that's by the Buddha. Because the question is the wrong question, basically. We're looking in the wrong place. We're asking the wrong question. And in this case, it's very clear that the Buddha didn't postulate any kind of soul or permanent essence. So even asking whether it's the same as the body, you can't answer that, right? If there's no actual essence or soul, the way that we would maybe think of it in perhaps Christianity or other religions, or even Hinduism, right? That there's this kind of paramatma, this consciousness that sort of pervades everything and exists forever. So it's the wrong question, basically. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know how much time is wasted when we try to answer questions that don't make sense or we argue about the question. And here it's more saying we just set it aside. So it's kind of a much more peaceful resolution. So I think that's already quite a lot on this one. Shall we go on, or are there any questions on that, or any comments or examples, other examples that come to mind? Anything? We only have a small group today, so I shall carry on. And again, please do feel free to write in the chat if you're not comfortable with your voice being recorded. Your video will not be recorded as usual. So here it's just the opposite of that. If this person is asked a question that should be answered categorically and they answer categorically, it should be answered after making a distinction and they answer after making a distinction. They're asked a question that should be answered with a counter question and they answer with a counter question. And asked a question that should be set aside and they do set it aside. In such a case, this person is fit to talk. It is in relation to talk, monastics, that a person should be understood as either fit to talk or unfit to talk. If this person is asked a question Aha, so this is the next little category here, and it's getting a little bit more subtle. And as my friend very wisely noted earlier today, it's getting a little bit more off course as well, because the last one relates mainly to debate. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're saying anything particularly harmful, right? It just means that you're maybe not a good person to engage in discussion with because you haven't understood the Dhamma deeply enough. And even if you have, you're not able to actually express and explain it very well. But the next bit is a little bit more difficult because this person wavers and seems a little bit untrustworthy. Maybe they have a lot of doubt. So it is in relation to talk, monastics, that a person should be understood either fit to talk or unfit to talk. If this person is asked a question and they do not stand firm in regard to their position and the opposing position, so that's the first one. If they do not stand firm in their stratagem, if they do not stand firm in an assertion about what is known, and if they do not stand firm in the procedure, in such a case, this person is unfit to talk. So they seem a little bit confused. And they sort of waver when you ask more about it. And then not standing firm in the procedure, I think probably relates a little bit to the Vinaya, or to the way that things should be done. So this is looking, I think, a little bit more of the context and also the person's, I don't know. Have you ever met people that kind of waver all the time, and one day they say they believe one thing and try and convince you of it, and the next day it's completely changed again? After a while, it's kind of futile and pointless to keep talking with them. And I think it shows a certain lack of integrity as well, right? When we are very quick to proclaim something or to take a stand on something without really knowing what we're talking about. So maybe in this case, it's better not to be in debate. Or it's certainly better not to speak with this person as a sort of source of authority or reliability in some way. So then the opposite, if this person is asked a question and they stand firm in regard to their position and the opposing position, if they stand firm in their stratagem, if they stand firm in an assertion about what is known, and if they stand firm in the procedure, in such a case, this person is fit to talk. Just reminds me of my own teacher and many of your teachers, who is your teacher too, many of you, Ajahn Brahm, which, one of the things that I always notice is that he doesn't compromise. Even if somebody maybe isn't ready to hear the Dhamma at depth, he won't kind of bend or dilute or twist it in any way to please. So that is a certain integrity. I mean, certainly the Dhamma, the way it's expressed, will depend on the person's capacity to understand, how deep you go or the words you choose, but the actual principles, the actual doctrine that he understands and has understood through a lot of experience won't waver, won't change. And so these kind of people are very reliable. And of course, most of what they say is based on direct knowledge as well. And so this gives you a kind of confidence. And then, of course, we want to talk to such people. And what they say makes a lot of sense, right? It doesn't change because they're in a bad mood or, because they're kind of fed up with explaining it or because they've forgotten, because this is something that's very deep in their heart. So any questions on that bit or any comments? I'd be quite interested to know if any of these stand out to you and you have examples of your own, or confusion or queries or anything like that. Nothing. Okay. So just put your hand up anytime and I will notice it and you can engage. Okay, so the next one, things are sliding here. And it's quite interesting to notice. One of the people here actually was at the Vihara while Ajahn Brahm was here. And it's interesting to notice that sometimes in conversations, it starts off pretty wholesome and then it tends to slide and to degenerate a bit. And while we were here, we were having a kind of after lunch discussion and lighthearted chat about crazy things we did as children, you know, or as teenagers, going to various rock concerts. And then it was like, okay, what else have you done then, Ajahn Brahm? What else have you done, Venerable Canda? And you tell me what you've done. And we started to share these things, which was very sort of amiable and kind of funny. But at some point, it was just kind of not really serving much of a purpose. And Ajahn Brahm was very smart and very on the ball and just said, okay, I think it's degenerating now. I'm going to have a rest. And as soon as he said that, it was the perfect time to say it. Like, we didn't let it kind of go on. And I think all of us felt it was probably enough. And we were all like, yeah, sure, that's a good time to end, you know. And I think that's really helpful, isn't it? If you have somebody there who can kind of monitor and have that overview and doesn't kind of carry on due to any feeling of like social pressure, right? Because so often we feel like we have to keep going with a certain train of conversation just to fit in. And actually, when somebody's true and somebody just says, okay, actually, that's enough, you're giving a gift to everyone else, because most of the time the others also know it. They're just not confident enough to say it, or they haven't come to that point of like, you know, recognition of the conversation that slipped. So I found that very interesting and a really beautiful kind of container, in a sense, like a protective container for right speech. Because Ajahn Brahm obviously enjoys a good joke and sharing stories, but at the same time he knows the right measure, which I think is beautiful. So here we can see it's going a bit downhill. So the next one, if this person is asked a question and they answer it evasively, or they divert the discussion to an irrelevant subject and display anger, hatred, and bitterness, in such a case, this person is unfit to talk. So now it's not just that they're unsure about their knowledge, they're actually trying to avoid answering, right? And trying to divert things so that you don't even notice that they're not fit to talk with, or that they're not knowledgeable on something. And it reminds me also of the kind of speech that's not actually speech, it's more an omission to speak the truth than, you know, actually saying a lie. So rather than being straightforward and direct, we actually sort of hide and try and wriggle our way out of things, especially if we are confronted with the truth. And I don't know about you, but I've often been hurt that way, you know, when people won't actually show that interest in really understanding, but kind of try to avoid talking to you or just stop talking to you altogether, and don't really want to hear both sides, right? So I think this is also pointing to the importance of being really open. And if you don't know something, rather than being evasive, just say, I don't know, right? I mean, certainly as someone who likes to share the Dhamma and who's been kind of asked to do that, I have to say that quite a lot. And if I didn't, you know, I'd be in trouble, because I'd be kind of, you know, trying to drag stuff out that I'm not really sure about. So it's much, much better and gives rise to more confidence in others, I think, if we can just say, okay, this isn't something I know directly. My understanding is this, but I may be wrong, right? We don't just try and evade the question. So we do that, or we divert it to an irrelevant subject, you know, start just spinning off about something else. And this is something, you know, that happens when, especially with people that might have narcissistic tendencies or behaviors, or, you know, gaslighting, as apparently the word of the year, perhaps in America, I'm not sure, but I read in a psychology newspaper that it's the word of the year. Is that right, Bill? Yeah. And I think that is a kind of gaslighting, right? Just evading and discussing irrelevant things, you know, maybe turning it on you. You're asking a question that you just want an answer to, and it's like, you always have to ask that, you know, what's wrong with you? Don't you trust me, etc. And coming out with all kinds of excuses not to be straight and clear. So obviously it's difficult to trust a person like that. And then they display anger, hatred, and bitterness. So their frustration with being kind of untruthful and being pinned down is kind of coming out now in anger, hate, and bitterness. But if this person is asked a question and they do not answer evasively, divert the discussion to an irrelevant subject, or display anger, hatred, and bitterness, in such a case, this person is fit to talk. So these opposites are also just as important, even though it's always couched in a kind of not doing the negative. You know, if somebody never does that, you know, it gives such a sense of trust, doesn't it? You know, they don't just divert it to something irrelevant. They're still with you on that subject. They're listening. And they're not displaying anger, hate, or bitterness. And some people, you know, like some of my teachers, I've definitely said things that would cause, you know, maybe irritation or impatience with ordinary people, but with them, they just don't display that frustration at all. It's as if they have all the time in the world for you, all the patience in the world. And, you know, these people are not taking it personally in any way. So there's no kind of fuel for anger, hate, or bitterness to arise. And that makes it very easy to be very open and transparent with one's teacher. So it's getting even more intense now. And you can just imagine this, right? In a debate where nobody's really, you know, keeping their cool, and everybody's really kind of keen to get their side put forward and be right. So it's in relation to talk, monastics, that a person should be understood as either fit to talk or unfit to talk. If this person is asked a question and they overwhelm the questioner, crush him, ridicule him or her, and seize upon a slight error, in such a case, this person is unfit to talk. Bill's nodding. I don't know. Have you an experience like this? Do you want to share? I'll ask you to unmute. I think I have to.
Yeah. I'm too fast with the finger. Hi. So yes, I mean, this is particularly in what I do as a person in finance.
As a what? Sorry.
Particularly for somebody who does what I do, which is I'm in finance.
Finance. Okay.
And so people will do that in order to get me to agree to give them money, because that's what I do. And so I experience that all the time.
Wow. That's really intense. You mean the seizing upon a slight error or the crushing, ridiculing?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And how do you deal with that?
So this is a real issue for me, in that I have a very sharp Irish tongue, and so I can cut very deep. I stay quiet because I know when I speak like that, it's not out of benefit, but it's out of a reaction to harm, as I have been harmed.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to really practice being quiet. This is a daily struggle for me.
Wow. That sounds like an incredible practice, though. And, you know, the recognition that if you give back, you're almost becoming like that person, isn't it? You're being dragged down to that level. And to the extent that they kind of attack you, it's quite likely that a similar attack will come back. It becomes like it just escalates the whole thing. So, gosh.
It can. I mean, it's not every single day, but it's very frequently when I say no,
Right.
and they want yes, then there's the negotiation. And then it's also having children do the same thing.
Right.
You
Oh,
told
gosh.
him that I could go to the movies, and he said he could.
Oh, gosh, that must be so difficult. And do you sometimes change your mind and say, okay, you can go? I guess you have to sometimes.
Sometimes I do.
For the sake of peace. Yeah.
Well, for the sake of fairness.
For the sake of what, sorry? The parents.
Fairness.
Oh, fairness.
All right, you're right. I let him. You can.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So we'll negotiate.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I think that's really inspiring for the kids when the parents are able to say, actually, maybe you're right, you know, and my value is fairness. That's like such a relief.
My parents never did.
No. I won't say too much.
No, but yes, I'm very, very, everything you're talking about is I experience on a daily basis, either within myself in wanting to one up on somebody out of an unkind place that I have to check on my own, or being checked by somebody else trying to. It can be this is possibly the biggest piece of my practice right now is right speech.
Amazing. Yeah, and it's so much more than right speech, what you're describing, because it's also looking inside and being mindful of your reactions, right? And noticing like when it's likely to lead to wrong speech. So you're kind of catching it much earlier.
Yeah. And I think I missed it, but you were talking, I work at the same time we're on this. The more I meditate and the deeper I practice, the better my mindset is, so that it does make it easier, so that I'm not subject to saying the wrong things or cracking inappropriate jokes. I'm king of inappropriate jokes. King. It's a crown I would like to give away.
Okay. Yeah, I think you share that with a few people, not just you. Oh, that's wonderful. That's really inspiring, actually. And it also just brings home the importance of metta practice, because I think what you're doing, when you say trying to, what did you say? Like change your mindset, it's like where you're coming from, right? Maybe seeing those people as like suffering and, just trying to be happy, but going about it the wrong way, or going about asking you for something the wrong way, expecting the yes and getting the no. And if we practice this loving kindness, then we're addressing our motivation, which of course brings a lot more spaciousness and capacity to stay centered and to stay kind, even in the face of people who are quite hostile. So yeah. I always
the
like to
sutras
club
talk
metta.
about that. Yeah, well, the sutras, and I bought Bhante Sudasso got me to buy one of the Cobotes books. I got the blue one.
Oh yeah, the Buddha's words, yeah.
Yeah, and so within
Right.
it talks about that when you for me, having the meditation gets me the mindset, and the mindset then prohibits me from having wrong speech sometimes.
Exactly. So the whole path just kind of reinforces, each factor of the path reinforces the others, right? Whether you start at the meditation, then it feeds back into right view and right intention, or whether you start, in your daily life. Like basically the whole thing is just circling and strengthening itself. So it's great. I mean, I don't envy you at all, and I wouldn't like to work in finance. It's probably the last place I'd like to work. Hence, I'm a bikini who doesn't deal even with using money. But at the same time, it's obviously an amazing field to practice that, and to practice that restraint as well, which is, of course, going to feed back into your practice. So, yeah. And practicing right speech with people, because obviously at work you experience quite a lot of the opposite. So maybe making that connection with people who you can have a Dhamma discussion with, like you are doing, and just seeing how it feels to have a different kind of dialogue and to practice that right speech. Yeah. Super duper.
Give thousands of examples. Let's keep going.
Okay. I think Ashira has a question. So thank you very much, Bill. I'd like to come to you. Did you raise your hand, Ashira?
Yes.
I shouldn't assume it's a question.
That's fine. No, it is actually. So yes, with all of the different stages that we're looking at, and when we're looking at the different tenets of what makes an individual kind of fit or unfit to speak on something, it feels like there are probably quite a lot of people out there who have some of these different features that might make them, like, for example, unfit to speak. But what do the sutras say in terms of how we interact with those? I mean, in everyday life, you have to come across some of these people, and and I'm wondering, like, we can't kind of just all of them out, to say, like, even with Bill's example, he comes into contact with so many different people who have these kind of things that make them unfit to speak on things, and yet we need to be non-judgmental and
Right. Good point. And it's really good that you raised that, because I think we have to remember the context of this sutta, which is not so much discussing with the people in your daily life. This really directly relates to people that we want to talk to understand the truth. So when it's talking about people who are fit to talk with here, I think you'll see from the next paragraph, actually, we'll try and finish the sutta, that it's actually looking at who you would take to be a wise mentor, or maybe even a possible teacher, like the kind of person that you would actually go to for advice, and go to, presuming they have a kind of wisdom, like how to check a person out in that sense. So it's more in that context, because you're quite right. I mean, if we would say, well, just you're not fit to speak with because you've got this and this and this, we wouldn't be speaking at all, and no one would be speaking with us either. And then we wouldn't get to practice right speech. So yeah, I think we have to take this in the context it's intended, and yet at the same time obviously notice that if somebody is crushing you, ridiculing you, etc., diverting the conversation, they're probably not the kind of people we want to associate with outside of necessity, you know, because again, the Buddha did praise wise friendship as the whole of the path. And I think that's for a reason, because the practicing of right speech is a part of the practice, not just hearing it or thinking about it, but actually practicing it, you know, having Dhamma discussion, not even just reading suttas, but discussing those suttas, like it's all part of the path and it's necessary to progress. So I think, yeah, I mean, part of the thing for us is also not to judge, right? I mean, that's also right intention, is not to judge. To be kind is also, as a listener as well, to be kind and gentle with everybody. So we don't just kind of shut people out, but we might not go to, say, somebody who regularly shouts at other people to ask for advice. So I think it's looking more at that in this particular context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfectly clear. Thank you.
So I think we're pretty much on the last part now. So I'll just do the counter of that part. Seems I'm muted. For how long have I been muted? 1 second or more? Can anyone speak? 10 seconds. Okay, that's all right. So I was muted when I just, I think, probably did the counterpart. So basically, if one does not overwhelm the questioner or crush, ridicule, or seize upon a slight error, in such a case, this person is fit to talk. And then the last paragraph here, you'll see that it does really relate to, it seems to relate and suggest that we're trying to find out who is actually a stream winner or an Arya, a noble person. So we're looking for someone who's wise here. In relation to talk, monastics, that a person should be understood, it is in relation to talk that a person should be understood as either having a supporting condition or not having a supporting condition. One who does not lend an ear does not have a supporting condition. One who lends an ear has a supporting condition. One who has a supporting condition directly knows one thing, fully understands one thing, abandons one thing, and realizes one thing. Directly knowing one thing, fully understanding one thing, abandoning one thing, and realizing one thing, one reaches right liberation. This, monastics, is the goal of talk, the goal of discussion, the goal of a supporting condition, the goal of lending an ear. That is the emancipation of the mind through non-clinging. So I don't know if that sounds a little bit technical when it talks about supporting conditions. So in my understanding here, it means the supporting conditions for stream winning to arise. And as you've maybe heard many times from good Dhamma teachers, and especially if you were on the last retreat with Ajahn Brahm and I about the art of disappearing, we were talking so much about the path not being anything to do with you as a person or your abilities or even your efforts, but much more to do with conditioning, how you're conditioned, the kind of people you associate with, the kind of teachings you hear, you know, what you do with your mind, where you're coming from. and coming to practice from the right place. So this is what it means by supporting condition. Like, does that person actually, have they had a chance really to become enlightened? Or would it be impossible in their particular case? And then it says, one who does not lend an ear does not have a supporting condition. And here this is because the word of another, or I think Bhikkhu Bodhi called it something a bit different to the word of another, but basically the same thing, is one of the factors necessary for stream entry. And the word of another means hearing the teachings from someone who has understood them to the level of becoming an Arya, to becoming a noble one. So at least a stream winner again. So this is somebody who has right view perfected, you know, who knows that there's just suffering arising, suffering passing away, and who knows that there's no kind of lasting, indivisible essence of a being inside. It's just a process of cause and effect, right? We're conditioned processes, not kind of eternal souls, you could say. So one who has a supporting condition directly knows, understands, abandons, and realizes one thing. And realizing one thing, they reach right liberation. So I would guess here that that one thing is the Dhamma, but it could also be the suffering. It probably is the suffering, actually. Knowing, suffering, understanding, abandoning, and realizing, one reaches right liberation. But I'm going to check the footnote, which is number 6 in the back. So one directly knows one thing, i.e. the noble path. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. They fully understand one thing, the truth of suffering. They abandon one thing, all unwholesome qualities. And they realize one thing, the fruit of arahatship or cessation, nibbana. By means of knowledge, they reach right liberation, emancipation by the fruit of arahatship. So in the sutta itself, it doesn't say that a person's fully liberated. It just talks about even the first stage of stream winning, but it could go all that way. And of course, in the last bit here, it says the emancipation of the mind through non-clinging, which usually does refer to a fully enlightened process. So we've still got about 10 minutes. So is there something we should say on this, or should I read the final little poem? Or you can read the poem by yourself if there are questions now, because it's really nice to end on that. It's a beautiful, uplifting little poem. So I'll take one more if there's anything, or otherwise I'll read the poem. Okay, you're all quiet. Here we go. So this is a kind of summation of what we've just learned. But it's very, I find it very uplifting. Those who speak with quarrelsome intent, settled in their opinions, swollen with pride, ignoble, having assailed virtues, look for openings to attack one another. They mutually delight when their opponent speaks badly or makes a mistake. They rejoice in their bewilderment and defeat, but noble ones don't engage in such talk. If a wise person wants to talk, having known the time is right, without quarrelsomeness or pride, the sagely person should utter the speech that the noble ones practice, which is connected with the Dhamma and the meaning. Not being insolent or aggressive, with a mind not elated, one speaks free from envy on the basis of right knowledge. One should approve of what is well expressed, but should not attack what is badly stated. That's what Bill does. Tries not to do. One should not train in fault finding, nor seize on the other's mistakes. One should not overwhelm and crush their opponent, nor speak mendacious words. Truly, a discussion among the good is for the sake of knowledge and confidence. Such is the way to the noble discuss things. This is the discussion of the noble ones. Having understood this, the wise person should not swell up, but should discuss things. Beautiful. So just to end, before I hand over to Manori, who's going to say a few words about things coming up, I'd like to go back to the last line of the sutta, which says, "This is the goal of talk, the goal of discussion, the goal of a supporting condition, and the goal of lending an ear. That is, the emancipation of the mind through non-clinging." In other words, liberation from all suffering. That's the goal of talk. So if we can really incline our speech that way and think of it only in terms of deepening in Dhamma so that we can understand it fully, how different might our speech really be? Great. So thank you very much. And yeah, Manoj is going to say a few words on Dana, and maybe you can also mention some upcoming teachings. And if you forget any of that, I can add. Thank you.
Yeah, so today's Sutta discussion was possible because of your generosity and Dana to Anukampa Bhikkhuni project. As you know, the Anukampa Bhikkhuni project depends on the generosity of people who value it aspires to do. And I'm adding the link in the chat box for you to use it later. Your Dana will be used for maintaining of the new vihara in Oxford, and also for supporting Venerable and for the future developments of the projects as well. About the events, there is a new post in the Facebook page about December events, and also it is updated in the website. And Venerable, do you want to tell anything about Sunday's programs?
Oh, I don't think I have one on a Sunday.
Yeah, December there are
Yes.
no Sundays
Yes.
programs.
Yeah. In December, I need to settle a little bit, but what I am going to be committed to are the Friday Sutta classes. So I think we have another 3 before the new year. And we also have 2 metta sessions next Saturday on the 10th and then on the 17th. And the Sunday, we'll see what happens. I mean, I have a lot of teaching now on the ground, and I obviously want to develop and focus on like growing local community. So it's not going to be as full a program as it used to be, simply because I'm only one person, so I can't do every role. But we can think about the Sundays. I will also think about some guest speakers and maybe do a Q&A from time to time. Also, the Wednesdays, I will come back, if that's okay with Manoj, because she's been doing a wonderful job in my absence. And we actually met together with Ajahn Brahm and showed him a little stanza or 2 of our of the chanting that we do on a Wednesday, and he joined in. It was so sweet. Everyone went quiet, and it was so sweet. So I know she's been doing a lovely job. So I'll probably start doing that on Wednesday this week. Next Wednesday, is it? It's Friday now. So that'll be every Wednesday, but it won't happen when I'm doing other retreats. So there's also the New Year retreat for Sheffield Insight from the 29th, 30th and 31st. It's 3 days, non-residential, but you can come to just 1 day or 2 days if you wish. I think they're also going to do that on Zoom and possibly live stream. Yeah, is that right, Shel? So yes, I prefer if you can actually get there, because it's obviously a much nicer atmosphere, but even if you can't get there, you can still join in. And then, yeah, it's not on our website yet, but I am doing a teaching day for Oxford Insight at the end of Jan, and one for London Insight in March or something. So anyway, that will all come out in the next newsletter once I've actually caught my breath. And as far as offerings go, at the moment, again, we're still busy sort of settling and getting things together, but there will be like needed items lists made up, which can include anything from a toothbrush to a cabinet, probably not to a car yet, but you know, anything basically, so that you can have a look on there. And if you want to contribute something for the new vihara, then you're very welcome. And there'll also be the chance not only to come and offer dana in person, but to send shopping deliveries like we used to do during the corona pandemic. Hopefully now I'll have guests who can cook for me and for the community. And yeah, and we'll try and get some kind of roster system going so that we do have everything covered in terms of my basic needs and the needs of any other bhikkhunis and sangha members who come here. I do have some tentative news that we may have a visitor eventually, another bhikkhuni visitor. So I'm looking forward to that, probably in the winter. And Bill's asking if I'm coming back to the USA. I definitely am, but probably not this winter. I did think I might come in the winter, but I think I need to settle in really. And you've seen that behind me I have the beautiful Patachara. She's not very vivid because the camera's not very good, but we actually want to get some big Buddha rupas. So I'm trying to source that as well. So it really feels like a monastery and not a house. So there's a lot going on. And also, of course, if you want to come and stay, I think we're having a minimum of 3 nights because just to preserve the practice atmosphere. Otherwise, it can become a little bit like a hostel for me because I have to, meet and greet every guest. So you're very, very welcome to offer dana. And, there may be exceptions made from time to time, but generally speaking, 3 days and up to 7 days for your first visit. So please do get in touch, and you can get in touch at team@Anukampa Vihara. Yep, thanks, Minori. Sorry, not Vihara. team@anukampaproject.org. So that's for any correspondence. And thank you. Thank you for your thank yous, and thank you for your lovely practice. So we'll say goodbye. It's exactly 8 o'clock. So can we unmute everybody? Does anyone know how? You can stop the recording first.